Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm just going to cover a couple of housekeeping items before we officially get started. For anyone who is a registered dietitian on this call, I just put a survey into the chat box. If you would, please save that link and complete the survey after we finish this session. And after you complete that, I'll be able to send you your CPEU certification. Also, just a couple little housekeeping things related to Zoom. Please try to keep your microphone muted while we're in the session. You're welcome to keep your video on or turn it off, really whatever your personal preference is. And if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box during the segment. We will have time for questions at the end, but if you ask a question in the middle of the segment that's related to what we're talking about, I'll have our speaker answer some questions on the spot as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Beth Kitchen, and she will get us started today.
Thank you so much, Tara. We're really excited to see so many people here today. Thank you for joining us. Today's segment is, of course, about neonatal nutrition, specifically how to feed a preterm infant. And we have with us a very special guest, Maggie Jerome. She is a registered dietitian nutritionist. She's also a certified nutrition support clinician, and she is a neonatal dietitian, and she's very passionate about what she does. And so we're really excited to have her share that passion with us today. She's also a PhD student in the UAB Nutrition Sciences Department, and she will be sharing some things about her research that she's doing. She's doing a lot of really exciting things and getting a lot of attention for her work. It's really wonderful. We're really proud of her. So please welcome Maggie Jerome. And Maggie, what I'd like to start with you today is to have you tell us a little bit about how you became interested in neonatal nutrition, because I know there are a lot of people out there, summer students who might be interested in going into this field. So tell us about your career trajectory so far.
Yeah, so like Beth said, my name is Maggie Jerome. Uh-oh, gosh, now I can't change the slide. Let's see, there we go. So what we're gonna talk about today is just a little bit, about my career trajectory. We'll talk about prematurity, the prevalence of prematurity, some normal infant nutrition, and some common complications or challenges for preterm infants, our nutrition concerns and kind of our nutrition interventions in the NICU, and then the role of the dietitian. So going back to your question about kind of how did I get here, I did my undergraduate degree at Auburn University. I did my master's degree in dietetic internship at Texas Women's University in Houston. And while I was there, the opportunity to complete the Baylor College of Medicine Neonatal Nutrition Fellowship came up. And this wasn't traditionally open to dietetic interns, but this was the first year that they had that as an option. And so I, as a poor graduate student, found out that it was a paid fellowship. And I was like, well, I need some money. Like, I'm going to apply for that. I'm going to try that. And the first week of it, I just completely fell in love with this area of nutrition and being in the NICU. And it was just such a complex and interesting place with so much to learn, and somewhere that nutrition makes such an incredible difference. And I just was like, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. Like there's no chance. This is what I'm doing forever. So that's kind of how I got into the NICU, is really just by chance, pursuing this random opportunity, and it just stuck and I fell in love with it. So my first job was at the University of Kentucky Healthcare NICU, which you can see a picture of their beautiful center here. And I don't have any pictures of me from work there, but I do have a picture of me drinking bourbon in Kentucky. So I figured like that's about as Kentucky as you can get. I worked there for about a year. And then my second clinical job was at the Oregon Health and Science University NICU dietitian in Portland. And so I was there for a couple of years, and this is me out by Mount Hood, which I feel like is one of the other like most Portland things you can do. So those are my kind of clinical background in the NICU. And then now I'm a third-year PhD student in the Department of Nutrition Sciences. I'm also a trainee at the Nutrition Obesity Research Center on one of the T32 grants. And my mentors are Dr. Chandler Laney, who's in the Department of Nutrition Sciences, and then Dr. Ariel Salas, who is in neonatology. So I have kind of an interdisciplinary like co-mentors. And my research really focuses on nutrition practices and body composition in preterm infants in the NICU.
I love your origin story. And I think it shows people that sometimes you may take an opportunity for, other reasons that maybe you're not particularly interested in that. But in your case, like, I need the money. This would be great. And then you end up actually falling in love with something that, you never really knew was out there for you. So I think if you're a young student out there, or even a not so young student, that sometimes these opportunities come along and you fall in love with something that you never really thought about. Maggie, I'd like to get started talking about, for me, I know very little about pediatric nutrition, neonatal nutrition. So can you sort of start off with some definitions, like what exactly is the difference between pediatric and neonatal nutrition? And then let's get into, what defines a preterm baby. So let's start with some definitions so we're sort of all on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the first things you asked was the difference between pediatric and neonatal nutrition. And so pediatric would just be, any like children like under 18. And so neonatal would then be like a subset, like under pediatrics, like another kind of specialty. And that just neonatal, just referring to infants. And then some other definitions, like you mentioned. So we know that normal infant gestation ranges from 37 to 42 weeks with an average of 40 weeks. Like that's what we expect with a term pregnancy. So premature is any infant born less than 37 weeks gestational age. And we actually have some different ways to classify premature infants. We can classify them based on their weight or based on their gestational age.
And so, we talk about low birth weight and preterm. You can have a baby that's of normal gestational age, but be low birth weight. So we don't just define preterm by their birth weight. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So the classifications by weight are really kind of independent of their gestational age. So low birth weight is kind of the first classification. That's any baby born less than 2,500 grams, which is about 5 pounds and 8 ounces. And there, you can be low birth weight without being premature. And so that's kind of like a different subset of nutrition considerations. The next kind of classification of preterm infants based by weight would be very low birth weight infants. And these are infants born at less than 1,500 grams or about 3 pounds and 5 ounces. And then we have extremely low birth weight infants, which are born less than 1,000 grams, which is around 2 pounds.
These are really teeny tiny little babies.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do these classifications play into the nutrition needs and the recommendations that you make? That's a big question, isn't it?
No, it's important. So the reason we kind of bring up these classifications is that different subsets of infants kind of have different nutritional concerns or different like severity of nutrition concerns. So one example is like with osteopenia of prematurity. That's something that we really worry about in our extremely low birth weight infants, but in our low birth weight infants, it's not as much of a concern. We don't see that issue as much. So it's kind of a way that we can gauge different infants' risk for certain factors. And of course, there's a lot of that outside of nutrition, but from a nutrition standpoint, these classifications are also typically used when creating like our feeding guidelines. So you might say that every infant born under 1,500 grams then kind of falls into this nutrition protocol, and we advance their feeds a certain way versus infants that maybe fall into the 1,500 grams to 2,000 gram birth weight. So it's just kind of a way that we can gauge their nutrition needs and their risk and how we plan to treat them.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll be coming back to this a lot as we talk about this throughout the session. How common is prematurity nationwide and then also in Alabama?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So worldwide, about 15 million babies are born preterm every year, which is about 11% of all births. And then unfortunately, about 1 million babies die every year with complications from prematurity worldwide. And it's the leading cause of death of children under 5. Here in the United States, about 1 in 10 babies are born preterm. And about 1% of babies are born at that very low birth weight category. And we know that there are racial and ethnic disparities in regards to preterm birth. For example, in 2017, the rate among African American women was about 50% higher than white women, with them delivering about 14% of all births preterm compared to 9% of preterm births among white women. And you mentioned here in Alabama, we have an even higher prevalence of prematurity, with about 12% of all infants born in Alabama born preterm. This is the third highest in the nation. And about 2% of all Alabama infants are born at that very low birth weight category. And preterm birth is the leading cause of death of infants in Alabama. And the March of Dimes actually gives every state and every county in the United States a grade as it relates to prematurity. And unfortunately, here in Jefferson County, I have our report card here, and we received an F in prematurity with a preterm birth weight of about 12%, which was actually worse from the previous year. So it's definitely an issue that is really common here in Alabama, and I think it's something it's important for everyone to be aware of.
Wow, it looks like only Shelby County, like among the counties you're showing us, they've got the best score, and that's only a C. And it's getting worse every year. So that's tragic. Why is Alabama so bad? Is it ethnic health disparities, poverty? What do we know what the links are?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and one I don't know that we have a definite answer to, but a lot of the risk factors for delivering premature, we have a high prevalence of here in Alabama, like, chronic disease and poverty and racial and ethnic disparities. So similar to a lot of other chronic health issues that we see high prevalence of in Alabama, that is directly related to the high rates of preterm birth that we see.
That's so sad. I hope that that's something that changes over the next years and decades. So before we get into talking about preterm nutrition, can you just give us, like I said, especially for people like me that don't know that much about pediatric and particularly neonatal nutrition, give us a quick overview of a full-term infant nutrition guidelines, just so we know what we're comparing it to.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know, I have normal up here, meaning like full-term infants. So breast milk is the, best thing that we can feed an infant as long as it's, available and safe to use. So breastfeeding, is recommended by almost every major organization, as far as like the best way to feed an infant. We know that there are benefits both for the infants, reducing risk for a lot of chronic disease, but also there's benefits for the mom as well. We also, just as a reminder for everybody, we know that breastfed infants will need some sort of vitamin D supplementation. So we know that breast milk provides for almost every, nutrient possible for these infants, except for we have to supplement vitamin D for our breastfed infants. And then as far as, formula is an appropriate alternative to breastfeeding. We know that formula is strictly regulated by the FDA. It comes in liquid and powder forms and a lot of different varieties, for different infant preferences or different parental preferences. And then one other guideline that I don't have here on the slides, but it's just kind of a reminder to everybody who doesn't work in this area, we start solid foods around 4 to 6 months of age. So up until that 4 to 6 months, babies are recommended to be exclusively breastfed or exclusively formula fed. up, and then solids start to be introduced around that 4 to 6 month time.
That's a good reminder. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. So as we start talking about preterm infants now, so breast milk for full-term infants, but what are the issues? What are the biggest issues with preterm infants? I mean, I automatically think of you got to get them to gain weight. You want them to get bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of before we get into the nutrition concerns, I figured I would just give kind of a brief background of some of the medical considerations, some of the issues that preterm infants face while they're in the NICU that then shape what we are able to do nutritionally. So while they're in the hospital, preterm infants, depending on their how preterm or how small they are at birth, may experience pauses in breathing, which we call apnea, breathing difficulties, which is called respiratory distress syndrome, different complications like brain bleeding or heart issues, and then some common things that we come across in the hospital and other populations like infection with sepsis. And then preterm infants are also at risk for having jaundice or anemia and chronic lung disease. Those are all kind of the issues that they might face in the neonatal intensive care unit.
And so but then you are, yes, the nutritionist with all of these complications. Yeah. So what is that like?
Yeah, so it's definitely a learning curve if you don't have a background in this area. It's a lot to learn, but it's definitely doable. But it really is important to try to get a foundation of all of those kind of medical complexities, all of the medical issues that these preterm infants are facing, so that you can really understand like physiologically what's going on and how what we do with nutrition is impacted by all of these conditions, or maybe not impacted by some of these conditions. So it's really important to kind of get a background in all of those issues that preterm infants are facing.
Yeah, it sounds like there are so many things going on in nutrition. Even as nutritionists, that's our top of mind concern, but a lot of other things going on there that we need to understand in order to give them the best care. So getting bigger, growing is obviously important. So what are the goals for growth here, and how do you manage that with all of these complications that they're facing?
Yeah, so like I just was kind of showing some of the complications that these infants can face, going into childhood, like feeding difficulties or different developmental issues, or vision or hearing problems. And then there's a lot of complications, that are directly related to what we can do nutritionally. But kind of getting back to what you said, like why, so they have all of this other stuff going on, like why are we so concerned about nutrition? And it's really because like this time that premature infants are in the NICU is a really critical time period for brain growth and development. And so we know, for example, that like faster rates of weight gain, length, and head circumference are all tied to better neurodevelopmental outcomes in infancy and childhood. And even just like on kind of a more granular level, we know that the calories and protein that a preterm infants receive during the first week of life is associated with neurodevelopmental outcomes out to 18 months of age. So we know that like what's happening, nutritionally, we care about them getting bigger. We want them to develop those organ systems and get stronger so that they can go home, but also just because they're in such this critical time period for brain growth and development, that really kind of is directly related to the nutrition that they receive during that time.
So, talk about the growth. Like, what is the typical course for growth throughout this process?
So the AAP, American Academy of Pediatrics, recommends that all preterm infants grow to kind of mimic fetal growth. So we want them to grow as if they had stayed in utero during that time. So that is our goal for the preterm infants. And we'll talk about kind of some ways that we measure growth a little bit later on, but just kind of our overarching goal is we want these infants to grow as if they had stayed in utero the whole time and continue to grow and develop normally that way. And we know that this is a really critical time because nutrient deficiencies will really quickly turn into poor growth. So if we're not meeting, calorie, protein, some micronutrient needs, you're going to see really quick turnaround in that and showing like poor weight gain or poor linear growth and those types of things.
So how, talk about, this. This is great. What is the normal course, and how do you as a dietitian make sure that they are growing at the correct rate? How do you feed them? I mean, I think about how do you feed them?
So that's a really good question. I'll just try to give kind of like a brief overview of like what we typically see in this population. And when I'm talking about when I'm referencing like preterm infants in this way, I'm kind of talking about like the very low birth weight infants, the extremely low birth weight infants, not like the ones that were just born like a week or two early. So this is kind of the population that I'm talking about. So when these infants are first born, we can't just start feeding them, right on up to the amount that they need full feeds right away. So we support them with parenteral nutrition for the first week or two of life so that we're meeting all of their nutrition needs while we slowly introduce the feeds, the breast milk that they need. So the kind of first phase is this kind of full parenteral nutrition phase where almost all of their nutrients are being met by parenteral nutrition, IV nutrition. And then once they kind of stabilize medically, we kind of start to introduce some feeds, some breast milk, and that's going to be introduced via either an NG or OG tube because these infants haven't developed their suck, swallow, breathe reflex, so they're not able to orally eat at this point. So we vary this image just kind of shows, when we start, they're on this full parenteral nutrition, and in the blue that kind of represents the IV nutrition, and then the yellow kind of shows how we slowly introduce their breast milk feeds and we slowly decrease the parenteral nutrition until they're all the way on like full enteral nutrition, which we kind of represent with this breast milk picture here. So that transition phase can take anywhere from like a week or two while we're transitioning away from parenteral nutrition and to full enteral nutrition. And then we kind of enter this feeding and growing stage where the infants are getting bigger, they're on full enteral nutrition. When they come to about 32 to 34 weeks, then they start learning how to eat, and you transition a little bit, you slowly work up on their oral feedings and away from their tube feedings, and they work on that until they're able to go home. So that's just like a really brief overview of what you would expect to see with like a very low birth weight infant and kind of in terms of their nutrition support.
So I want to go, this is so interesting. I want to go back to phase one and ask you a few questions, because when I see full parenteral nutrition for any baby, but especially a preterm baby, that sounds so scary to me as a dietitian. I mean, honestly, it's like, oh my gosh, what are some of the things that you consider as you are, as the dietitian, making the recommendation for how that parenteral nutrition is formulated?
So you want to be familiar with the parenteral nutrition needs as far as calories and protein and some of the micronutrients. Let's see, one major consideration is you have to think about what type of IV access they have. So they might have a peripheral line or they might have a central line. And that kind of dictates, how much dextrose and how much calcium you can put into those, into your parenteral nutrition formulation. You want to consider their tolerance of the parenteral nutrition. So, you might initially write an order with a certain amount of dextrose, but then the next day you see that they're really hyperglycemic. So then we might need to tone some of that down. And similarly with the lipids. So it's really kind of a balancing game of knowing their needs, but then responding to their, lab values and just kind of making adjustments that way.
It sounds pretty intense, and you have to monitor these babies constantly, it sounds like. So a lot of constant monitoring is what it sounds like.
That's true.
So you talked a little bit about the calories, and it seems like that, early on growth is important, but it sounds like the big growth is coming a little bit down the road. What about some of the other nutrient needs? We talked about, calories and growth, and that's really important, but what about protein and micronutrients?
So all of those, almost like every nutrient need is higher in a preterm infant per kilogram of body weight compared to a term infant. So for example, with calories for a preterm infant, it's recommended that they get about 110 to 115 calories per kilogram of body weight compared to a term infant who only needs about 105 to 110 calories per kilogram. And protein is a nutrient that preterm infants need significantly more of compared to a term infant. I have those numbers here just so you can see, like 3.5 to 4.5 grams per kilo of protein for preterm infants compared to just 1.5 gram per kilo for term infants. And then it's a really similar pattern with the micronutrients. Some of the ones that we are most concerned with would be like calcium and phosphorus, zinc, and iron. Those are some of the ones that we really worry about them developing deficiencies with.
So it's a lot to think about. Are all of those individually added into the formulation?
So that's a really, really good question. Like we know, just like kind of we talked about earlier with the term infants, we know that mom's milk is the #1 choice for infants, and that's both preterm infants and term infants. Something that I found really amazing that I think a lot of people aren't aware of is moms who deliver early, their breast milk is actually higher in certain nutrients compared to moms who deliver term. And one of those nutrients is protein. It's kind of the body's way of like reacting to those higher nutrient needs.
It sounds like the mom's milk naturally matches the stage of the infant's needs a little.
It does, which is really amazing.
Except for vitamin D, but
yeah, we do have to add vitamin D. There's a lot of other nutrients that are the same in preterm milk versus donor milk, so we do still have to kind of address a lot of those nutrient needs, but it's just kind of, one of those like amazing features of breast milk, along with the bioactive components, anti-infective components. There's like prebiotics and growth factors and immune benefits that are specific to like that mom and that baby. So going back to kind of what you're saying, like how do we add these nutrients that these babies need? We have what's called human milk fortifier, which are this like highly concentrated little packets of nutrients. Like it adds, fat, carbohydrate, protein, and all of those micronutrients in these little small packets that we add to breast milk to then increase the nutrient density of the breast milk, but while still feeding that like ultimate source of nutrition that babies need.
Now, one of the things, and you had it on the previous slide, that I always think about is what about moms who aren't producing enough breast milk, have trouble or don't want to pump for whatever reason? When, this is very interesting to me that women can donate breast milk. How does that work? That's fascinating.
Yeah, that's one of the really interesting, aspects of feeding these babies. So we know that breast milk is what's best for these infants, but just like you said, sometimes there are moms for whatever circumstances, aren't able to breastfeed or aren't, maybe their breast milk is taking slower to come in, or there's, endless different possibilities that but we still want to provide that preterm infant with breast milk because we know all of the benefits that it provides to the baby. So we have the availability of donated breast milk. And so most of these breast milk banks are run by the Himbana breast milk or donor breast milking organization. And moms can volunteer to provide their any like extra breast milk that they might have for these preterm infants, you know, so that they're able to have donor breast milk. It's pasteurized. And unfortunately, that means that there are kind of fewer bioactive substances. There might be some nutrients that are like damaged in the freezing and thawing cycles, which can lead to a little bit slower growth. But we know that it reduces those infants' risk for this really deadly intestinal infection called necrotizing enterocolitis. And it's a way that, you know, through this like donor breast milk, we can provide breast milk to infants whose moms are, you know, maybe not able to breastfeed. So it's a real amazing resource that we have in the NICU.
That's a really wonderful thing for someone to do, because it's not an easy process, I would imagine.
No, it's not an easy process. There's a lot of like hoops kind of that the moms have to go through, you know, getting clearance from their physician, getting clearance from their baby's physician. And, you know, there's different like screening that they have to go through to finally then be able to donate the breast milk. So it's really amazing that we have so many moms that are willing to do this. And, you know, we know how much work goes into, you know, providing not only, you know, pumping the breast milk, but then being able to donate it. So, you know, we try to treat it as like a very, you know, limited resource and use it judiciously and respectfully of those moms who took the time to do that.
I guess those are just typically these super producing women and just like have this, it's just so interesting to me. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, it's really amazing.
It really is. It's really neat. So how, as the little babies are growing and they're improving, how do you monitor them as they get closer to going home?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So I just wanted to add, in addition to, you know, fortified breast milk, we also, if, you know, moms that don't want to use donor milk and aren't able to breastfeed, we do have preterm infant formulas that are specifically designed to meet these infants' needs, which is, you know, also an appropriate alternative in certain instances. So like you were saying, kind of how do we monitor these babies once they're like on their fortified breast milk or they're, you know, on their formula? So they kind of enter into this feeding and growing phase that you'll hear used in the NICU a lot. And that's just kind of where they're on their nutrition plan, like they're on full feeds. We're monitoring growth. We'll periodically monitor certain lab values and then make adjustments to the fortification. Maybe they're not growing well, so we need to add a little bit more fortification, or maybe we need to use a higher calorie formula. And kind of during this feeding and growing time is when these infants start learning how to eat orally. So around that 32 to 34 week gestational age mark is when infants kind of start developing that suck, swallow, breathe reflex, and they're able to start eating orally. And it's a very kind of incremental process, you know, where they're first just introduced to a couple of milliliters orally, and then they kind of, you know, it's like a muscle, they, you know, learn how to eat. And during that time, you know, they'll still have like the tube feeding that will, you know, then gavage the remainder of whatever they're not able to eat orally until they get to the point where they're actually eating everything by mouth.
Since they are developing the sucking reflex at that point, can the moms actually breastfeed them at that point? I'm sure some of the moms just really want to breastfeed their little babies. Is that possible then, or is it still kind of it has to be a little bit more controlled than that?
So a lot of it is kind of individualized to that mom and that baby. So what if the mom, sometimes moms just say like, I'm not worried about directly breastfeeding. Like I'm going to be going back to work. So I'm going to be, you know, pumping and, you know, going to be like fortifying breast milk for a while. So I don't want to worry about that. But some moms say it's really important to me that the baby feeds at the breast. So when they are starting to develop that suck, swallow, breathe reflex, depending kind of on their respiratory status or other different issues, they might start going to breast just to kind of like for comfort, or, you know, maybe like after mom has already pumped. And so they're not going to be getting, you know, a ton, because when they're kind of learning how to eat, we don't want to overwhelm them. with too much, but there's different ways that they can kind of practice those skills at the breast. And then a lot of that happens kind of outside of the NICU. Once they're going home, once they're getting a lot stronger and their oral skills are a lot better, they can kind of work on that direct breastfeeding, because that can be kind of more challenging for an infant who has been bottle fed so much. So they kind of have to work on their stamina. But it's definitely, if that's like a priority for the mom, it's definitely something that can be incorporated into their nutrition plan.
And I'm glad that you touched on formula, because I think it's really important. We all know breast milk is best, but the formula is a really good alternative. And I think it's important to, not make moms feel bad about using formula, because there can be a lot of emotional distress around that sometimes when a mom can't breastfeed or for whatever reason doesn't want to, that the formula is a really good alternative.
Yeah, it is, especially like after they're outside of the range of being at risk for some of those like intestinal infection issues. Once they've crossed that kind of threshold and they're at lower risk for that, and maybe mom is not wanting to breastfeed or didn't have the breast milk available, we do have those formulas that are specifically designed to meet their nutrient needs that are definitely can support their growth and development.
So talk about their expected growth, like you have right up here for us.
Yeah. So just to give everybody just a kind of what we normally see or what we hope to see in the NICU for preterm infants is we hope them to, all of our weight gain goals are going to be based on how big they are. So for instance, you might have like a 700-gram baby. You wouldn't expect them to necessarily gain weight at the same rate as like a baby double their size, like 1,400 grams. So we talk about their weight gain in grams per kilo. So what we expect to see with these infants is about 15 to 20 grams per kilo per day. And it might be more or maybe a little bit less depending on their size and their clinical course. And we compare that to a term infant where we just talk about their weight gain in grams per day, not per kilo, which is about 20 to 30 grams per day. When we're talking, length is another thing that we pay really close attention to in terms of growth. And we expect a preterm infants to gain about 1 centimeter per week. And that's just a little bit less than a term infant who's typically gaining around like 0.8 or 0.9 centimeters a week. And head circumference is one kind of metric of growth that we see really big differences again between preterm and term infants. So with preterm infants, since they're in this like really critical period of brain growth and development, it's expected that their head circumference increases about 1 centimeter a week. And we can compare that to a term infant who their head circumference is really only changing by about like 0.4 centimeters a week. So there's really drastic differences in what we expect in terms of growth for preterm infants compared to term infants. And one way that we kind of measure or benchmark their growth to see if they're growing appropriately is using growth charts. So there are growth charts, which I think most people, are familiar with, that the WHO growth charts that are specific for term infants, but we have these other special growth charts for preterm infants where we can monitor their growth and make sure that they're kind of on the right trajectory. So with these growth charts, we can plot their length, their head circumference, and their weight. And we kind of just want them to follow the trajectory that they would have followed in utero. So we want them to kind of follow along their percentile so that they would grow. We're hoping to see them grow similarly to how they would have grown in utero. So this is one of our like really important tools as far as like nutrition monitoring.
So as they get close to going home, how are they prepared to go home? What do you do as a dietitian?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So a lot of people want to know like, oh, do they need to be a certain weight before they go home? Like, or do they need, what has to happen? Like, how do you know they're ready to go home? And what most neonatologists will tell you is there's like certain milestones that they need to meet, which I have listed down here. So they need to be breathing on their own, normally without any apnea or bradycardia spells. They need to be able to maintain their temperature outside of one of those like really warm isolettes. And they need to be able to eat all of their feeds by mouth and be able to maintain appropriate growth. So, as a dietitian, you're kind of like monitoring the infant. You're seeing like, oh, they're getting, really good at their oral feedings. They're outside of the isolette. It seems like they're getting pretty close to going home, and you kind of confer with the medical team. They'll let you know like, oh, this is definitely coming up. And so you kind of work with the medical team, with the parents, to create this home feeding plan. And it can be a little challenging because those fortifiers that we talked about, those preterm infant formulas that we talked about, those are not usually available for parents to just go buy, at Walmart. So we have to create this nutrition plan that works with, the products that we have available in the outpatient setting. And so what we have to do is kind of work with everybody to come up with a nutrition plan to support that baby's growth, and then transition them to that plan several days before they leave the NICU, so that we can make sure that they tolerate it well. We can make sure that they're actually gaining appropriate weight on that plan, and that it's going to be something that's feasible in the outpatient setting. So it's definitely kind of like an art and a science, working with everybody, making sure that it's a feasible plan for the parents, making sure that the infants grow well, and that it's, a good plan for everybody.
So this is a very team approach situation, clinical
Absolutely.
situation, and the dietitian is a really important part of that team. How, how does that all work together? What part of that is something that you really like or have challenges with? And what advice would you give to RDs who might be interested in going into this particular area?
Yeah. So I've figured, people might ask, like, what do you do like as a dietitian? Like, what is that actually? How do you spend your time?
One of the things that popped into my head, Maggie, too, was like, how many babies are you monitoring at one time?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. So that's going to depend drastically on what NICU you're in. So like I think like the recommended ratio is like 30 babies for every dietitian, kind of in that realm. But there are definitely hospitals that don't have that type of like NICU dietitian presence or support, where a dietitian might be responsible for monitoring like 60 or 80 or 50 babies. So then obviously like you're not able to get as in-depthly involved with every infant. But when I was working at OHSU, we would typically have like 20 to 30 patients. So we were able to be like really heavily involved in like all of the infants' nutrition care and support. But just like you said, in the NICU, the dietitian is a really essential member of the multidisciplinary team. In all of the places that I've worked, the dietitian, attended daily medical rounds. And so you were really like integrated into that interdisciplinary team. And then some institutions will operate where the dietitian sees different infants based off of consults. So you're kind of in that role, you're responsible for monitoring growth throughout their entire hospitalization. You might help establish and facilitate the use of different feeding guidelines. So like, for this set of infants, that are born at this birth weight, we, want everybody's feeds to be started and advanced at this rate. But then for this group, this is what we're going to do. You can be really integral in creating those feeding guidelines. Depending on where you are, you might make recommendations on or actually write the parenteral nutrition orders. That's something that tends to vary significantly from at different facilities. And then, essentially you're recommending interventions if the infants aren't growing well. So like one, kind of basic example of that would be this infant, they're falling off their growth chart. They're not growing the way that they need to. We need to increase the calories in their formula or something along those lines. And then also, as that like nutrition expert, you can do education with the parents, with the students, with different healthcare providers, and just kind of make sure that that everybody, you know, is up to date on the literature in this area and make sure everybody is on the same page.
It just sounds like you have when you are a NICU RD, it's a very dynamic, high-paced, high-energy kind of situation.
Yeah, it's something I, you know, definitely enjoyed about that position. And, you know, I think a lot of NICU dietitians really enjoy that aspect of it.
I know you're very passionate about being a clinical dietitian in the NICU, but you're getting your PhD right now. What do you see for your career? Tell us a little bit about your research and, you know, kind of like, what do you want to do? I know you kind of want to get back into the clinic, but you're going to have this PhD and be doing research. What do you see for yourself in the future?
Yeah. So, just a little bit about my research. It's all focused on premature infants and body composition. So I have the tool that we use here. It's called the P-POD that we use to assess body composition in the NICU. And so this body composition tool will provide us with estimates of fat-free mass and fat mass. And the reason we care about that is that fat-free mass is really predictive of neurodevelopmental outcomes later in infancy and in childhood. So we think that, you know, fat-free mass, it's giving us an estimate of like that lean body growth, which really, you know, includes all the muscles and the organs, but also like brain growth. So that's why we really care about body composition, because it's another you know, measurement that reflects that like high quality growth that we want to see in these preterm infants. So my research is focusing on nutrition and like non-nutrition factors that affect body composition. And so in terms of, you know, what I hope for my career, right now I am back in school full time, and I just really miss, you know, that clinical aspect. And I'm hoping to be able to, you know, find a position or create a position where I'm able to both do this clinical work, but then also, you know, have time for research and kind of have my own like research career, just because I think it's really important to kind of have the research, you know, inform our clinical practice, but then also our clinical practice inform our research. We don't want people, we need people who do, you know, just research and just clinical work, but, you know, I think it's really important to also have people bridge that gap so that we make sure that our research is informed by clinical practice, and then we're able to translate that into, you know, translatable research.
And you've had an article published, you've gotten funding for your dissertation?
Yes, I found out last week that I received a grant from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics Nutrition Support Group to fund one of the studies as part of my dissertation, which I'm really excited about. So that we have that underway. That'll be the last kind of aim of my dissertation. So I'm really excited about that. That was really exciting to learn about. So I'm definitely kind of in that publishing and just like in the midst of all of that research right now. It's an exciting time.
We're all so proud of you. I mean, did you think, I mean, when you started out and you took that, was it a fellowship? I forget the actual name. Did you think this is where you'd be? I just think it's neat that you've just blossomed and been so successful. Did you see this happening? Did you see it coming?
Not really. It's funny to me, when I was in college in Auburn, I had one professor who said to me, "You're definitely going to do like critical care nutrition. I can just see that's for you." And I was like, you don't know what you're talking about. Like, I thought I wanted to do something completely different. And then I had another professor that was like, "You're going to get your PhD one day. I think that's going to work out for you." And I was like, "No, I don't think so. You guys don't know anything." And then it turned out that yes, I do critical care in the NICU and I'm working on my PhD. So I didn't really see any of this coming. I never expected that I would enjoy the NICU as much as I do. I never really expected that I would want to go back to school again. It sounds crazy sometimes, even when I think about it now, but I just love this area so much. And I just wanted to be able to contribute, you know, from a research and from a teaching perspective as well, as the clinical work. So I'm just hoping to be able to, once I'm done with this, to combine all of those things.
So they were both right. They both
they were both right. Yeah.
Both right. That's so funny. So we have a few minutes left. Any questions that we have, Maggie? Anything that we haven't touched on? Any closing advice, particularly for students, young dietitians who might be thinking maybe they want to get into this area? Anything that that you want to leave us with today?
Sure. Yeah. I think if this is an area that like interests you, what I would say is it's really exciting and interesting, and it takes a lot of work to kind of learn all the stuff that maybe we didn't necessarily learn in school. But don't be, intimidated by it. It's definitely, doable for any dietitian that is, passionate about preterm infants and nutrition. There's a lot of or I shouldn't say a lot. There's several programs out there similar to the one that I did, different like fellowships or training programs that can help train you specifically for the NICU. And that's the route that I went, and I highly recommend it because I felt like I was just able to get a really quick crash course in this area that I didn't learn about it in school. Like I never had a class on any of this stuff. So it was really like nice to have that specific focused training in this area. And then, just other advice really for anyone trying to specialize in any area of nutrition. I feel like it's really important to kind of take ownership of your own education and really like read as much as you can. Like the first year that I was in the NICU, I would watch a webinar every week just to kind of fill in the gaps and maybe what I didn't learn during that fellowship, or new research, or just to kind of give me more confidence as a clinician. So that really helped me, was just kind of like repetitive exposure to like experts in the field who are able to tell you what's the cutting edge nutrition recommendations, and then you're able to use that and build your own confidence. And I really recommend that for anybody who is kind of breaking into a new area of expertise. That really helped me a lot.
You really put a lot of extra work in on your own.
Yeah, I think you have to if you want to be successful in that role, because just like you said, it's complicated, it can be intimidating, but if you spend the time learning all of these different aspects of their medical care, you develop that confidence to say like, I understand what is happening physiologically, and I can like translate that into nutrition recommendations.
Yeah, I mean it is complicated, but it also sounds really, really interesting. It just sounds, and the fact that you're such an important part of the team and recognized by the other practitioners as being an important part of the team. And that's a really special feeling that you don't always get everywhere, depending on what specialty area you're in clinical. And I think that's a good feeling to know that you're valued.
Yeah, it is. That's one thing I've always really enjoyed about working in the NICU is, everybody is invested in the babies growing and their nutrition, because like that's how they get stronger. That's how they go home. So, you kind of feel like everybody has nutrition on like the forefront of their mind usually. And so it's easier to get buy-in from the medical team. The parents understand the importance of nutrition. And so it's a really exciting place for a dietitian to be.
Sounds very fulfilling watching these little babies get to go home.
Yeah, you get to see them grow every day.
My God. That and their parents are probably, it's one of those areas where people are, I'm sure, just so grateful to what you do, because you're seeing these little babies get to go home to their families. And that's gotta just, what was that like the first time? You remember the very first time you had a baby go home, and was that like a neat feeling?
I can't know if I remember like the very first time, but there are like really some cases that stick out in my mind, and then sometimes if you're lucky enough to like stay in contact with some of the parents, and or if you ever go to they have like NICU reunion days, and you can just see babies that you saw at like 500 grams into happy beautiful children, and that is just like crazy. It makes you feel like a little emotional sometimes.
I can see that. We had I think I told you I have a cousin who was premature. He's in his 40s now, so this is a long time ago. And, they didn't know. I remember the phone calls and not knowing if he was going to make it. And so I think almost all of us know someone, whether it's in our family or friends, that had a premature baby, and how really scary and frightening it is. And when they, seeing them go home and grow up to be healthy adults, he now has kids, and I mean, it's neat, and it's very, very special. Well, if we don't have any other questions, thank you all for joining us. If you have any questions, you can unmute if you want. You can talk to us, or you can type them in. We got a war eagle from Cammie.
Yeah, war eagle.
Awesome. So thank you, everyone. Tara, do you have any? I want to tell you guys very quickly. Our last episode of the year, we're going to skip December for obvious reasons. People get really busy around the holidays, but our last one of the year is going to be November 16th. I'm super excited. It's going to be Dr. John Waterbour. He teaches epidemiology in the School of Public Health. He was my epidemiology teacher when I was getting my PhD. He's a riot. He's super smart. What we're going to talk about is sort of following up. Many of you had expressed interest in learning more about statistics and translating research studies. So we're going to do a deeper dive into that with Dr. Waterbour, and I really think you'll enjoy him. So mark your calendars. It's a little bit earlier in the month because of Thanksgiving. So it's a little earlier than typical. It's going to be on Monday, November 16th. We're really excited. It's going to be fun. And what a great episode, Maggie. We learned a lot.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Maggie, so much for joining us. And I know we've talked about it. I'll share with the group, though. We'd love to have Maggie back to share more about her research once she gets some of that published. She's right on a critical point now of proposing her doctoral research, going into candidacy, and publishing some of her findings. So we're not going to bug her too much for specifics of her results yet, but once she gets that published, we'd love to have her share those results with us.
We'll have a lot to share soon. So.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us. If you didn't see yet, in the chat is the Qualtrics survey to complete to get your CPEU. So please copy that before you exit the meeting, and we will hopefully see you on November 16th. Thanks again for joining us.